And after months of delays, both Turkey and Hungary say they are committed to approving Finland's bid for NATO membership. On Friday, both countries announced their support, removing the biggest barrier for Finland to join the alliance. Meanwhile, despite policy changes, Turkey and Hungary say a decision on Sweden's bid for membership will have to wait. Finland and Sweden sent applications to join NATO nearly a year ago, ending their policies of neutrality and military non-alignment in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Joining us now, President and founder of the Eurasia Group and G0 Media, Ian Bremmer. And Joe, I'll let you take it to Ian, but there are a lot of moving parts here, including what Elena Zelenska was telling us about at the 3050 summit in Abu Dhabi. She was talking about the children that were being abducted, Ukrainian children taken from their families.
Yeah, a lot to talk about here. Ian, let's start, though, with the news about Finland becoming a member of NATO. How important is that for NATO? And how much of a thorn in Vladimir Putin's side will that be?
It's significant. I think it's an 800-kilometer border between Finland and Russia itself. It's very well defended. The Finns spend well over 2% of GDP on their defense, unlike some other NATO countries. Of course, this is the exact opposite of what Putin was trying to accomplish when he invaded Ukraine. It was pushing back NATO. It wasn't getting more countries in. So, I mean, very clearly the fact that the Turks and the Hungarians, the two outliers in NATO that have been dragging their feet, are now fully on board, and Finland is more important from a security perspective than the Swedes are. Nothing personal, Swedes. That is not a happy piece of backdrop news for Putin today.
Yeah, so your take on the ICC issuing arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin for war crimes?
I would put it in the context of Putin traveling to Mariupol this weekend, where, of course, many of those war crimes were committed. This is a message from Putin to the United States, message to the Ukrainians. I'm going nowhere. I'm not prepared to give up on 1 inch of the territory that I am presently taking. This ICC arrest warrant for war crimes means nothing to me. Now, to be clear, Joe, you probably know that the Russians, the United States, and China are not members, the 123 members of the ICC, a strong majority of the world community, but not any of the countries we're talking about right now. They don't recognize the authority. So it is a bit problematic for Biden to say, yeah, we're very glad they did that. But of course, we wouldn't recognize it if it was about us or our allies. Still, of course, Putin is responsible for these war crimes. And the fact that he is, and the fact that he's made that trip to Mariupol literally hours before Xi Jinping is making a trip to Moscow also says a lot about the level of impunity that he feels and the willingness of Xi Jinping, second most powerful country in the world that he represents, supporting him, embracing him, and now about to talk about negotiations, which the Ukrainians, of course, have zero interest in at this point.
I'm wondering, Ian, if also that trip to Mariupol might not be a message to Xi, who, along with Modi and along with Erdogan, have been quietly pressuring Vladimir Putin to consider a possible peace deal.
I think they are prepared to push him privately and very soon publicly, in the case of Xi Jinping, to talk about a peace deal, to talk about negotiations. But those negotiations are going to look nothing like the 10-point plan that President Zelensky has put out, which he said he's willing to discuss. No. We're talking about a potential ceasefire where the Russians would be able to continue to occupy the illegally annexed territories that they are presently in, some 13% of Ukraine's total territory. And behind the scenes, the Russians have been going around to Europe saying, hey, when Xi Jinping calls for negotiations and when Vladimir Putin says, we're happy to do that, if the Ukrainians say no, China's going to provide us with weapons. China's going to put their finger on the scale. So there's a lot of pressure on you. Putin is feeling, certainly in his direct diplomacy with those involved in this conflict, Putin has felt more confident over the past weeks than I've certainly seen him since the first months of the war.
So Ian, let me ask you this next question. Keeping in mind what one of my law professors told me in a jurisprudence class, you have to be able to separate out what is from what ought to be. And I understand when people are talking about a possible deal at the end of this Ukrainian war. In the West, certainly, they want to talk about what ought to be. But from all the people you talk to day in, day out in your position, what does a settlement look like if we have, let's say, another 6 months to a year to 18 months of stalemate?
Well, first, I don't think we see a settlement. I think the question is whether or not both forces are exhausted and therefore not able to take more territory, either back if you're the Ukrainians or from Ukraine if you're the Russians. That's not a settlement. So, I mean, I think that you could end up with something that feels like a frozen conflict where the Russians have a little less territory than they're occupying today after the Ukrainian counteroffensive over the coming weeks, which is expected, and which I suspect will allow them to take some more territory, because the artillery and ammunition issue that they've been complaining about for a long time looks to have been quietly resolved. So they should be able to hit back against Russia in relatively short order. But there's no negotiation that's going to lead to a peace. And what that means is, irrespective of how much of Ukrainian territory the Ukrainians can get back, Russia is not going to be treated like a normal country again. Again, the fact that we're talking about war crimes, that Putin would be arrested if he were to travel to any of the 123 countries that are members of the International Criminal Court, that means that he and his regime are perceived as dead enders. They have nowhere to go but backed into a corner. And of course, in that environment, the willingness to continue to fight is very high. The willingness to continue to repress their own people under any circumstances is incredibly high. That's the concern, is that Ukraine, whether or not the Ukraine gets back most or all of their territory, Russia will lose on the global stage. In the same way that they've just lost on Finnish NATO membership, they are going to lose in terms of their diplomatic relations, their security relations, and their economic relations with every advanced industrial democracy in the world. And of course, that's exactly the opposite of what Putin wanted, the same Putin who said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest humiliation for the 20th century.
Ian, we should note, you mentioned that Putin would be at risk of arrest if he were to travel to one of the International Criminal Court countries, the host of the G20 this year, where Putin could theoretically attend. India, not part of the ICC, so that would perhaps not be a risk to him there. But let's talk about, you said the Ukraine counteroffensive. There's some ammunition worries that may have dissipated. This may happen the next few weeks. Ukraine also desperately pushing for fighter jets. We saw 2 NATO countries last week opt to start sending them that way, Poland and Slovakia. What's the latest you're hearing as to whether the United States may, and other Western allies, may follow suit?
No change in U.S. policy, also not an issue we need to worry about for months. Let's keep in mind that the MiGs that are being provided by Poland and Slovakia, those are not advanced jets. They won't perform well against the Russians, but the Ukrainians actually know how to fly them, and that is, of course, a help. There is no ability for the Ukrainians to even fly F-16s for a minimum of 6 months. What is absolutely critical is the ammunition. In order for them to launch these offensives, counteroffensive, they need 750,000 rounds of ammunition. And apparently most of that is now on its way to Ukraine. So in the coming weeks, we should actually see that counteroffensive begin.
So, Ian, you had an insight on Vladimir Putin, who's been obviously very hard to read over the last year and several months. I'm curious, you had said earlier that he was seeming more confident than he has been in a long time. What do you put that down to? Does he think he can outlast the West, grind down the Ukrainians?
I think there are 2 big points here. One is the fact that Xi Jinping is making a 3-day state visit to come and see him. Just a few months ago, September, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Xi Jinping was pressuring Putin, and Putin was forced to admit that the Chinese have concerns. This feels like a much better alignment between China and Russia, and in part that comes after these unprecedented hardline statements that Xi Jinping has made directly against the United States just a couple of weeks ago. So that's part of it. Secondly, of course, Putin is also getting the news from the United States, the fact that increasingly Trump and others on the Republican side that are running for the presidency are wavering in their level of support for Ukraine, are saying this potentially is a World War III threat. The fact that he thinks that the Americans are becoming much more divided matters a lot to Russia's ability to outlast NATO in this war.
All right, Ian Bremmer, thank you very much for your insight this morning. We appreciate it. And up next.